The kettle has just clicked off. You reach for your favorite mug, the one that's a little chipped at the rim but somehow still the right one, and you spoon in the leaves or drop in the bag. You watch the color bloom outward through the water, that slow, unfurling amber, and for a moment everything is still. You know how this goes. You've done it 100 times. The steam rises, and something in your shoulders drops half an inch. Whatever the day was, it belongs to the past now. This cup, this quiet, this moment, it's yours. It's such a small ritual. And yet, humans have been performing some version of it for nearly 5,000 years. Tonight, we're exploring the remarkable history of tea, one of the most widely consumed beverages on Earth, second only to water. A drink that began as a medicinal herb in ancient China, traveled the Silk Road into new civilizations, fueled empires, sparked revolutions, was stolen across borders, and somehow became the quiet anchor of daily life for billions of people across every continent and culture. Tea has shaped geopolitics, inspired philosophy, given comfort to soldiers, sustained factory workers, united strangers, and divided nations. It's been taxed, smuggled, traded for opium, and fought over in courts and on oceans. And through all of that, through every war and empire and industrial revolution it touched, it remained, at its heart, a simple act of warmth. What does your tea ritual look like? Do you have a specific mug, a certain way you make it, a time of day that belongs entirely to it? Let us know in the comments. And if this kind of slow, curious storytelling is your thing, a like and a subscribe is always the warmest welcome you can give. Now let's dive in. The story of tea begins, as so many good stories do, with a happy accident. It's around 2737 BCE, somewhere in the mountains of what is now Yunnan province in southern China. A man named Shennong, the divine farmer, one of the mythological emperors credited with teaching ancient Chinese civilization how to cultivate crops and use medicinal plants, is sitting beneath a wild tree, boiling water to drink. He was, by all accounts, a careful and systematic man. He boiled his water because he believed it made it safer. And on this particular afternoon, a small breeze drifted through the branches above him, and a handful of leaves drifted down into his pot. The water turned amber. He drank it anyway, and whatever he felt in that moment, clarity, warmth, a quiet alertness, was apparently significant enough that he made a note of it. In the classical Chinese medical text attributed to Shennong, the Shennong Benkao Jing, or the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica, the tea plant is listed among hundreds of medicinal herbs, described as something that could detoxify the body, sharpen the mind, and ease the spirit. Now, of course, Shennong is a legend. He's described in some texts as having a transparent body, so he could observe exactly how different plants affected him, and in others as having the head of an ox. He almost certainly didn't exist as a single historical figure. But legends don't survive for 4,000 years without carrying something real inside them. And what this one tells us is that tea was understood from its very earliest encounters as more than just a drink. It was medicine, it was ritual, it was knowledge. The actual botanical story of tea begins in the same part of the world the legend points to. The plant we now know as Camellia sinensis, the tea plant, is native to a region that spans modern-day Yunnan in China, parts of northern Myanmar, and the northeastern corner of India. This mountainous, humid, densely forested zone is likely where humans first encountered tea in the wild, long before anyone was brewing it. Archaeological evidence suggests that people were consuming tea leaves in some form as far back as 6,000 years ago, chewing them perhaps, or mixing them with fat and salt, and pressing them into cakes, a preparation method still used today in parts of Tibet and Yunnan. The earliest written records of tea being steeped as a beverage date to around the 3rd century CE, during the Han Dynasty. By then, tea had already migrated from the wild forests of the southwest into the gardens and kitchens of Chinese civilization. It was drunk by monks in Buddhist monasteries to aid concentration during long hours of meditation. It was drunk by Taoist practitioners who believed it extended life and facilitated spiritual clarity. It was prescribed by physicians for everything from digestive ailments to lethargy to mental fog. But it was during the Tang Dynasty, between 618 and 907 CE, that tea underwent its most significant transformation. From medicinal herb and monastic practice into something much larger. This was the period in which tea became a cultural institution. And the man most responsible for that shift was a writer, an orphan, and perhaps the most influential figure in tea's entire history, a man named Lu Yu. Lu Yu was born around 733 CE, abandoned as an infant and raised by a Buddhist monk at a monastery in what is now Hubei province. He grew up surrounded by tea. Monks drank it constantly, and he developed an obsession with it that he'd carry for the rest of his life. In his 20s and 30s, he spent years traveling through tea-growing regions, visiting farmers and processors, tasting and comparing and documenting. And somewhere around 760 CE, he completed a work called the Chajing, the classic of tea. It was the world's first dedicated book about tea, and it was extraordinary. The Chajing covers everything. It describes the geography of different tea-growing regions and how the terroir affects flavor. It explains how to properly harvest, dry, and process tea leaves. It dedicates entire chapters to the correct water for brewing. Lu Yu ranked different water sources and insisted that mountain spring water, collected midstream, was superior to well water or river water for bringing out tea's best qualities. It specifies the correct utensils, the correct temperature, the correct vessel. And it does all of this with a philosophical seriousness that elevates tea-making from domestic chore to art form. Lu Yu wasn't just writing a manual, he was making an argument. Tea, he believed, was a pathway to a particular quality of attention. Calm, refined, present. The act of preparing and drinking it properly wasn't just pleasant. It was morally and spiritually improving. To make tea well was to practice a kind of discipline. To drink it well was to participate in something larger than yourself. The Tang court agreed. Tea became an imperial obsession. Emperor Xuanzong reportedly had tea gardens specially cultivated to produce leaves reserved exclusively for the palace. Tea became a luxury item, a status symbol, a form of tribute. Certain regions were required to send their finest teas to the court as tax. Tea competitions emerged, in which connoisseurs would taste multiple brews blind and attempt to identify their origins, an early precursor to the wine and whiskey tastings we know today. And tea began to spread. Merchants carried it along trade routes. Buddhist monks carried it into Korea and Japan. Tibetan traders carried it across the Himalayas. By the end of the Tang Dynasty, what had begun as a leaf in a mythological emperor's pot had become the defining beverage of Chinese civilization. And it was just beginning its journey outward into the world. Tea arrived in Japan the way many of the most transformative things arrive, quietly, carried by monks. The first documented introduction of tea to Japan came in the early 9th century, during the reign of Emperor Saga. A Buddhist monk named Aiku, who had spent years studying in China, returned to Japan around 815 CE and reportedly served tea to the emperor at a palace in present-day Shiga Prefecture. Emperor Saga was apparently delighted. He ordered tea to be cultivated in the provinces near the capital, and for a brief period, it flourished as an imperial curiosity. But tea didn't yet have deep roots in Japanese culture. The imperial enthusiasm faded after Saga's reign, and for roughly 3 centuries, tea remained a minor presence, something known to the scholarly and religious elite, but not widely drunk. The real transformation came later, and it came, again, through Buddhism. In 1191, a monk named Myon Aisai returned from a period of study in China. He brought with him something new, not the compressed tea cakes that had been trickling into Japan for centuries, but powdered green tea, matcha prepared in the frothy, whisked style of the Chinese Song dynasty. He also brought back Zen Buddhism, and the two things arrived together, tangled up with each other in ways that would shape Japanese culture for the next 8 centuries. Aisai wrote a short text called Kissa Yajoki, roughly translated as How to Stay Healthy by Drinking Tea, in which he argued that tea was not merely a pleasant drink, but a gift from the heavens, a medicine for the nation. He presented a copy to the Shogun Minamoto no Sanetomo, who was reportedly suffering from a hangover at the time. Whether the tea helped is unrecorded, but the shogun's interest was captured, and tea began to spread through the warrior class. The combination of Zen Buddhism and tea created something philosophically potent. Zen practice emphasized direct experience over intellectual understanding, presence over abstraction, the profound within the simple and ordinary. A monk sitting in meditation needed to stay awake and alert. Tea helped, but more than that, the act of preparing and drinking tea. The attention it required, the quietude it invited, the way it anchored the practitioner in the present moment, aligned naturally with Zen values. Tea became a form of practice in itself. Over the following centuries, the connection between Zen and tea deepened and formalized. Tea gatherings became a significant part of aristocratic and warrior culture, with elaborate competitions and tastings that sometimes veered into extravagance and excess. But there were those who pulled in the opposite direction, who believed that the spirit of tea had nothing to do with luxury and everything to do with simplicity. The person who most fully articulated this counterpoint was a man named Sen no Rikyu, and his influence on tea culture was so complete that it's almost impossible to overstate. Rikyu was born in 1522 in Sakai, a port city near modern-day Osaka, into a family of wealthy merchants. He began studying tea as a young man and eventually came under the patronage of the 2 most powerful men in Japan, the warlord Oda Nobunaga, and after Nobunaga's assassination, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Under Rikyu's guidance, the Japanese tea ceremony was refined into what it essentially remains today. He developed the concept of wabi-cha, tea rooted in the aesthetic philosophy of wabi, which might be translated as the beauty of imperfection, transience, and humble simplicity. Where wealthy patrons were filling their tea rooms with imported Chinese ceramics and ostentatious decoration, Rikyu stripped everything back. He designed tea rooms of extraordinary plainness, low ceilings, rough plaster walls, small windows that let in soft, diffused light. He had a particular fondness for Korean rice bowls repurposed as tea bowls, irregular and unassuming things that had never been made to be admired. He believed that beauty lived in the crooked, the worn, the imperfect, in things that bore the marks of time and use. The famous Nijiri Gachai, the small, crawl-through entrance used in Rikyu's tea rooms, was deliberate. To enter the tea space, everyone had to bow. Warriors had to leave their swords outside. There was no social hierarchy inside the tea room. The only hierarchy was the tea itself. The principles Rikyu established, harmony, respect, purity, and tranquility, or wa, kei, sei, jaku, became the philosophical foundation of what is now called Chado, the way of tea. And these principles were taken seriously enough that Rikyu was willing to die for them. In 1591, following a dispute with Toyotomi Hideyoshi, The exact reasons remain debated, though they likely involved a combination of politics, pride, and a deliberate act of defiance. Rikyu was ordered to commit ritual suicide. He did so with composure, reportedly conducting a final tea ceremony before his death. He was 69 years old. His influence has never died. Today, the Japanese tea ceremony exists in multiple schools of practice descended from Rikyu's teaching. The Yureisenk, Amotsenk, and Mushokoji schools chief among them, all founded by Rikyu's grandsons and still active today. Millions of people study Chado in Japan and around the world. The ceremony itself, every gesture calibrated, every movement considered, the whole ritual unfolding in a particular order at a particular pace, can take years to learn properly and a lifetime to understand. But you don't need to understand all of its nuances to feel what it's doing. Every element is designed to produce one thing: presence. You are here in this room with this tea in this moment. Nothing else exists. The outside world, with all its noise and urgency, is on the other side of that small door you had to bow to enter. In here, there is only the sound of water beginning to boil, the smell of tatami, the weight of a ceramic bowl in both hands, and the quiet that settles over everything like snow. It's a remarkable thing when you think about it. That a leaf, carried across the sea by a monk over 1,000 years ago, grew into an entire philosophy of how to be present, how to slow down, how to pay attention to what's actually in front of you. Perhaps that's why tea and sleep are such natural companions. They both ask the same thing of us: stop rushing, arrive here. Let the world be quiet for a while. While Japan was developing its philosophy of tea, the leaf was also traveling in other directions. North and west across some of the most demanding terrain on Earth, carried by traders, soldiers, monks, and nomads along the ancient network of routes we collectively call the Silk Road. And the tea that moved along those routes looked almost nothing like the green tea we tend to picture when we think of China or Japan. It was hard, dark, and dense. It was compressed into bricks. Brick tea leaves steamed, pounded, and pressed into solid cakes or rectangular blocks, was the dominant form of tea in long-distance trade for centuries, simply because it was practical. A brick could be easily transported, stacked, and stored. It didn't spoil the way loose leaves might over a journey of months. It could be used as currency. And it was, extensively. In parts of Central Asia and Tibet, tea bricks served as a monetary standard well into the 20th century. Soldiers were paid in tea. Taxes were levied in tea. If you needed to trade for horses, furs, or grain somewhere on the high plateau, you counted out bricks of tea to settle the account. The tea horse trade, or cha ma gu dao, the ancient tea horse road, was one of the great commercial arteries of the pre-modern world, stretching from the tea gardens of Yunnan northward into Tibet and onward into Central Asia. The name comes from its most significant exchange. Chinese merchants traded compressed tea for Tibetan horses, which the Chinese armies desperately needed. The route wound through some of the most brutal mountain terrain on Earth, passes above 4,000 meters, river gorges, rockfall, and ice. And it was walked for over 1,000 years by caravans of mules and porters carrying loads that sometimes exceeded 100 kilograms per person. What happened to the tea when it arrived in Tibet transformed it into something the Chinese would barely have recognized. Tibetan butter tea, po cha, is still made today in much the same way it has been for over a millennium. Compressed tea is boiled for a long time, sometimes hours, producing a strong, dark brew. This is then churned in a wooden cylinder with yak butter and salt, sometimes quite a lot of salt, until it emulsifies into something thick and rich and warm. It's nourishing in the way that a meal is nourishing. In an environment where temperatures can drop far below freezing and caloric needs are immense, butter tea isn't an indulgence. It's sustenance. The fat provides energy. The salt replaces what's lost in the dry mountain air. The warmth is the warmth of survival. To a Western palate, it can come as a shock. Visitors describe it as something between tea and soup, greasy and savory, in ways that feel entirely foreign to someone raised on the British cup. But context is everything, and in the context of the Tibetan plateau, the wind, the altitude, the cold, butter tea makes perfect, beautiful sense. It's tea adapted to place. It's what happens when a drink meets a landscape and adjusts itself accordingly. Further north and west, along the caravan routes into Russia, tea was undergoing yet another transformation. The story of tea in Russia is one of the most interesting in the whole history of the drink, because it arrived so late and took hold so completely. The first documented delivery of tea to the Russian court came in 1638, when a Mongolian Khan sent Tsar Michael I a gift of several pounds of tea. The Tsar's ambassador was reportedly unimpressed by the dried leaves and considered the gift a poor one. He tried it, found it agreeable enough, and returned home with a small quantity. Over the following decades, tea made its slow way into Russian aristocratic life, carried by merchants along the caravan route from China through Mongolia. Because of the enormous distances involved, the journey from the tea gardens of Fujian to Moscow could take over a year and a half by land. Russian caravan tea was necessarily different from the tea being drunk in China. The long journey through cold air, the months of exposure, the rough handling, all of it changed the tea, giving it a distinctive smokiness and earthiness that Russians came to prefer. When sea routes eventually offered a faster alternative, many Russians reportedly found the fresher tea bland by comparison. They had grown up loving the flavor of a journey. The samovar, that magnificent brass urn, kept continuously hot, became the symbol of Russian tea culture in the 18th and 19th centuries. A samovar wasn't just a vessel, it was the center of domestic life. It sat at the heart of the family table, always ready, always warm. Tea was drunk strong. A concentrated brew called zavarka was prepared in a small teapot placed on top of the samovar, and diluted with hot water to taste. It was drunk with sugar held between the teeth rather than dissolved in the cup. It was drunk at every hour of the day. In Tolstoy's novels, in Chekhov's plays, the samovar is always there, quietly keeping watch over the human dramas unfolding around it. Meanwhile, in the markets and caravanserais of Central Asia and the Middle East, tea was moving through other cultures and putting down other roots. In the Persian world, tea was embraced enthusiastically once it arrived. The word chai, which now serves as the generic name for spiced tea across South Asia and beyond, is simply the Persian pronunciation of the Chinese word cha, carried westward along the same routes as the tea itself. The word fork in the road is fascinating here. Regions that received tea overland from China tended to adopt the Mandarin word cha in some form. Chai in Hindi and Russian and Persian, che in Turkish, cha in Portuguese. Regions that received tea later by sea from the southern Chinese port of Xiamen, where the local word for tea was tea, gave us the word we use in English and most of Western Europe, tea. The two words are the same word. They just took different roads to get to us. In the Ottoman Empire, tea was initially less popular than coffee, which had a centuries-long head start. But over time, especially after the early 20th century, when Turkish officials deliberately promoted tea cultivation as a way to reduce dependence on imported coffee, tea found its place. The distinctive tulip-shaped glass, the double-stacked Seydenlich teapot, the strong red brew drunk sweet and hot throughout the day. Turkish tea culture is now one of the most distinctive in the world. Turkey today ranks among the highest tea-consuming nations per capita on Earth, which is a remarkable trajectory for a country that didn't seriously take up tea until the 20th century. What the Silk Road teaches us about tea is something worth sitting with for a moment. This was not a drink that arrived in cultures and remained unchanged. It arrived and it adapted. It absorbed local flavors, local rituals, local ingredients, local needs. The Tibetan added butter and salt. The Russian added the samovar and the long journey. The Central Asian added spices. The Turkish added the tulip glass. Each culture took the same leaf and made it into something that felt entirely their own. That's not unusual for trade goods, perhaps, but tea seems to have a particular talent for it. Maybe because its basic form is so open, hot water and leaves, that it invites interpretation. Maybe because the act of making and sharing a warm drink is so universally human that every culture already had a space ready for it, just waiting to be filled. Or maybe tea just has a way of becoming whatever you need it to be, which, when you think about it, is a rather extraordinary quality for a leaf. Europe came late to tea, and when it finally arrived, nobody quite knew what to do with it. The first Europeans to encounter tea in any meaningful way were the Portuguese, who established trade routes to China in the early 16th century. Jesuit missionaries and merchants sent back curious reports of a hot beverage the Chinese seemed devoted to, describing it in letters with a mixture of wonder and mild bewilderment. Tea was noted, it was sampled. A small amount was brought back to Portugal, and then, for the most part, it was set aside. Eclipsed by the far more lucrative spice trade, and perhaps simply too unfamiliar to catch on in a culture that already had wine and wasn't looking for a replacement. The people who truly introduced tea to Europe were the Dutch. In the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC from its Dutch initials, arguably the most powerful trading corporation in history, was expanding aggressively through Asia. They'd established trading posts in Japan and were doing brisk business with China. And among the goods making their way back to Amsterdam were small quantities of Chinese tea. The first documented shipment of tea to Europe arrived in the Netherlands around 1610, carried on VOC ships. It was expensive, exotic, and available only to the very wealthy. But that, of course, was part of the appeal. In the salons and parlors of Amsterdam and The Hague, tea became fashionable almost immediately among the aristocracy and merchant classes. It was served in small, handleless porcelain cups imported alongside the tea itself. Europeans didn't yet have the ceramic technology to produce the fine, translucent porcelain that the Chinese had mastered, so the cups and the tea arrived together as a set. Entire rooms were fitted out for tea drinking. Special furniture was made. Silverware was commissioned. By the mid-17th century, elaborate tea sets had become status symbols, and wealthy Dutch households competed in the extravagance of their tea rituals. But tea didn't enter Europe without controversy. The medical establishment watched its arrival with deep suspicion, and a debate erupted almost immediately over whether tea was healthful or harmful. In the 1640s and 1650s, pamphlets and treatises flew back and forth across the continent. Physicians who had never been further east than Paris confidently pronounced on tea's effects on the human body, most of them working from theory rather than observation. One camp argued that tea was essentially a poison, that it dried out the body's vital humors, weakened the constitution, and would lead to premature decline. A Dutch physician named Cornelis Dekker, writing under the pen name Cornelius Bontico, became one of tea's most energetic advocates, recommending that people drink dozens of cups a day. sometimes as many as 50 or 100, as a cure for essentially everything. His enthusiasm was so extreme that his contemporaries suspected he was being paid by the Dutch East India Company. They were almost certainly right. The company had enormous financial incentives to promote tea consumption, and the line between medical endorsement and marketing was, at this early stage, essentially non-existent. On the other side, the anti-tea camp published warnings with titles like a treatise on the abuse of hot liquors, arguing that hot drinks in general, and tea in particular, overstimulated the nerves and corrupted the natural heat of the body. This debate sounds almost comical now, but it was conducted with complete seriousness by educated men who believed they were protecting public health. What it really reflected was the discomfort of encountering something genuinely new, something outside the existing medical framework, with no obvious category to place it in. Tea won the argument, as it tends to win most arguments, simply by becoming too popular to stop. From the Netherlands, tea spread to England. The exact route and timing are somewhat debated, but the most significant conduit was almost certainly Catherine of Braganza, the Portuguese princess who married King Charles II in 1662. Catherine was an enthusiastic tea drinker. She'd grown up in Portugal, where tea had been known for a century, and she brought her habit with her to the English court. Tea drinking at court became fashionable overnight in the way that anything associated with royalty did in that era. If the Queen drank it, people wanted to drink it. At roughly the same time, tea was beginning to appear in London's coffee houses. The coffee house was already one of the defining institutions of 17th century English life, a place where men of all classes could meet, argue, exchange news, and conduct business over a hot drink. Coffee was the dominant beverage, but tea appeared as a novelty option, advertised in the first English tea advertisements with claims that it was good for the memory, cleared the eyesight, aided digestion, and cured headaches. The claims were extravagant and largely invented, but they worked. Tea began to sell. It was expensive, though. In those early decades, tea was taxed heavily, available only to the wealthy, and traded in tiny quantities by specialized merchants. An ordinary English family could no more afford regular tea than they could afford a racehorse. The democratization of tea in England would take another century, and it would require, among other things, a war, a smuggling epidemic, and a rather dramatic act of political theater involving a harbor and 3 ships and the cold waters of a Boston winter night. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. There is perhaps no better example in history of a culture more completely conquered by a beverage than Britain and tea. It didn't happen overnight. In the late 17th century, tea was still a luxury, fashionable, desirable, and available mainly to those who could afford fashionable and desirable things. Coffee dominated the public sphere. Ale and beer dominated the domestic one. Tea was the glamorous newcomer, present at court and in the expensive drawing rooms of London, but not yet in the hands of the coal miner or the dock worker or the seamstress. The shift began quietly in the tea gardens of 18th century London. Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens and Ranelagh Gardens were 2 of the most famous, but there were dozens of them across the city. Outdoor pleasure grounds where, for a modest admission fee, ordinary Londoners could walk among fountains and flowers, listen to music, watch entertainments, and drink tea. The tea garden was a remarkable institution because it was genuinely democratic in a way that very few public spaces in Georgian England were. Men and women of different classes rubbed shoulders. A clerk could spend an afternoon in the same garden as an earl. Tea was the social solvent that made this mixing possible, a shared ritual that implied a certain equality of refinement regardless of one's station. Tea gardens remained popular through the 18th century, and they helped shift tea from an aristocratic habit to something broader, something aspirational that people across the social spectrum could access. By the time they fell out of fashion in the early 19th century, replaced partly by the newly fashionable indoor spaces and partly by the less savory reputation some gardens had acquired, tea had already made the leap from luxury to everyday drink. The price shift that made this possible was partly the result of government policy. Specifically, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger's Commutation Act of 1784, which slashed the tax on tea from over 100% down to 12.5% in a single stroke. The reason for this dramatic cut was the scale of tea smuggling that had developed in Britain over the preceding decades. It's estimated that by the 1780s, more than half of all the tea consumed in Britain had been smuggled, brought in illegally from the continent to avoid the punishing import duties. Entire criminal networks operated along the English coast. Gangs of smugglers with evocative names like the Hawkhurst Gang moved tea in enormous quantities, often with the tacit approval of local communities who benefited from cheap tea and saw no particular reason to help the government. When the legal tax came down to a level that undercut the smugglers, the trade mostly collapsed. Tea became officially cheap and consumption exploded. The East India Company had been at the center of the British tea trade almost from the beginning. Chartered by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, the company had grown into something that functioned less like a business and more like a state. It had its own army, its own courts, its own territories, and an extraordinary degree of political influence in London. For much of the 18th century, the company held a monopoly on tea imports to Britain, which gave it an enormous stranglehold on the nation's most beloved beverage. The profits were staggering. The political implications were considerable. Within domestic British culture, the rituals around tea were becoming increasingly elaborate and class-coded. The most famous of these rituals, afternoon tea, is commonly attributed to Anna Maria Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford, who in the 1840s apparently began requesting a tray of tea and small refreshments to be brought to her room in the late afternoon, to ward off what she described as a sinking feeling in the hours between lunch and the fashionably late dinner of the Victorian era. She began inviting friends to join her. The habit spread, and within a generation, afternoon tea had become a deeply embedded social institution across the British middle and upper classes. There is something very appealing about the Duchess of Bedford's story, and it may even be true. Though food historians tend to treat it with some skepticism, noting that tea and small foods had been eaten together in the afternoon for decades before she supposedly formalized it. What's not in doubt is that by the mid-Victorian period, the ritual of afternoon tea was firmly established, complete with its own rules about what to eat: thin sandwiches, scones with clotted cream and jam, small cakes, what to wear, how to pour, and in what order the guests should be served. The working classes, meanwhile, developed their own tea ritual: high tea, which despite its name was actually the less formal of the two. High tea referred to the main evening meal of working-class families, eaten at a high dining table rather than a low drawing-room table, and tea was the beverage at its center. Strong, dark, and typically drunk with milk and plenty of sugar. Working-class tea was a different drink in character from the delicate afternoon infusions of the drawing room, but it was just as culturally central. The factory worker's morning cup of tea, the miner's brew brought down in a flask, the seamstress's quick pot made on a small stove. These were as much a part of British tea culture as anything happening in Mayfair. By the time Queen Victoria died in 1901, Britain was consuming approximately 6 pounds of tea per person per year. Tea had infiltrated every layer of society, every class, every region, every kind of daily life. It was drunk at home and in the office, in the fields and on the ships, at births and funerals, and in the endless queue of ordinary days between them. It had become so deeply British that people had largely forgotten it came from somewhere else entirely, that this most quintessentially English habit had begun in the mountains of Yunnan and arrived on Dutch ships and been made fashionable by a Portuguese queen. It was theirs now. It had been absorbed so completely that its foreignness had disappeared. This is a pattern tea repeats everywhere it goes. It arrives, and within a few generations, it becomes impossible to imagine life without it. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists boarded 3 ships moored in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. It took them roughly 3 hours. The chests were heavy, 45 kilograms each, and the men worked in the dark and in relative silence, breaking open the chests with axes and hatchets and tipping the contents over the side. Witnesses watching from the docks described the tea floating on the surface of the harbor, the dark water slowly turning amber in the moonlight. By the time they were done, they had destroyed somewhere in the region of 90,000 pounds of tea. In today's money, the value of what sank into Boston Harbor that night was roughly $1.5 million. The Boston Tea Party, as it would come to be called, though nobody used that name for decades afterward, is one of the most dramatic acts of political protest in American history, and it was entirely about tea, about who controlled it, who profited from it, and who had the right to tax it. To understand how a shipment of tea became a catalyst for revolution, you have to understand the particular misery of the relationship between the American colonies and the British government in the decade before 1773. The 7 Years' War had left Britain deeply in debt, and the government had decided that the colonies, which had benefited, at least in theory, from British military protection during the war, should contribute to paying for it. A series of tax acts followed, each one generating fierce colonial opposition. The core colonial argument was simple and elegant. They were being taxed by a parliament in which they had no representation. No vote, no voice, no means of consenting to or contesting the taxes being imposed on them. Taxation without representation is tyranny, the colonists argued, and the phrase caught fire. The tea situation had its own particular twist of the knife. The Tea Act of 1773 was not, strictly speaking, a new tax. It actually lowered the overall price of tea in the colonies by allowing the East India Company to sell directly to American retailers, cutting out the middlemen who had previously handled the trade. You might think cheaper tea would be welcomed. It wasn't. The colonists saw through the maneuver immediately. Yes, the tea was cheaper, but the arrangement still included the townshend duty, a small tax that Parliament had imposed in 1767 and refused to repeal, insisting on its right to tax the colonies. To buy the cheaper tea was to implicitly accept Parliament's authority to tax them. Colonial merchants who had built profitable businesses around the smuggling of cheaper Dutch tea also had obvious financial reasons to oppose the arrangement, and the whole scheme so clearly benefited the East India Company, an enormous, politically connected corporation that many colonists already resented, that the anger it generated cut across economic lines. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, the radical patriot organization that had been agitating against British tax policy for years, organized the response. On the night of the 16th, a large crowd gathered at the Old South Meeting House to hear impassioned speeches. When the royal governor refused to send the tea ships back to England without paying the duty, Adams reportedly gave a signal, and somewhere between 30 and 130 men. Accounts vary. Dressed in rough disguise, some with faces darkened with coal dust and wearing the kind of blankets associated with Mohawk dress, made their way to the waterfront. The disguises were thin and largely transparent. Many of the participants were well known in Boston, but they served a purpose. They created a degree of plausible deniability, and perhaps more importantly, they gestured toward an American rather than a British identity. These men were not Englishmen aggrieved at Parliament. They were something new, something that didn't yet have a name. The British response was swift and punishing. The coercive acts, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, closed Boston's port, restricted colonial self-governance, and demanded that Bostonians house British troops. These measures were intended to isolate and punish Massachusetts, to make an example that would deter other colonies from similar acts of defiance. They had precisely the opposite effect. The other colonies rallied to Massachusetts's defense. The First Continental Congress convened in September 1774. The road to revolution, already well underway, accelerated sharply. It's worth pausing to notice something slightly absurd and entirely wonderful about all of this. The American Revolution, one of the foundational events of the modern world, which gave rise to the most powerful nation in human history, which established principles of democracy and self-governance that spread across the globe, was set in motion, at least in part, by tea, by 3 ships in a harbor and 300 chests of leaves, by the insult of a small tax on a drink. And the legacy of that night in Boston persists in ways that might surprise you. Americans, unlike their British cousins, have never fully embraced hot tea. The events of 1773 didn't cause this, exactly. The iced tea and sweet tea and canned tea that dominate American tea culture have their own histories. But there's something symbolically fitting about the fact that the country born from throwing tea into a harbor has always had a slightly arm's-length relationship with the cup. Britain drinks more tea per capita than almost any other country on Earth. America drinks comparatively little. The harbor, in some small cultural sense, is still between them. By the early 19th century, Britain had a problem. A rather embarrassing one. It was completely addicted to Chinese tea and had almost nothing the Chinese wanted in return. The trade imbalance was severe. Britain was importing vast quantities of tea from China, along with silk, porcelain, and other luxury goods, and paying for it in silver. Silver was flowing out of Britain and into China at an alarming rate. The Chinese Empire was largely self-sufficient and had little interest in British manufactured goods. When a British diplomatic mission led by Lord Macartney visited the Qianlong Emperor in 1793 and presented a selection of British industrial products in hopes of opening broader trade, the emperor's response was polite but dismissive. China, he explained, possessed all things in abundance and had no need of foreign goods. The British government and the East India Company spent decades trying to solve this problem through legitimate means and failed. Then they found an illegitimate one. Opium had been grown in India, Bengal in particular, for centuries. The East India Company, which controlled Bengal from the mid-18th century onward, had a monopoly on opium production. The drug had been used medicinally in China for a long time, but recreational use was limited and officially discouraged. The company saw an opportunity. If they could cultivate demand for opium in China, they could balance their trade deficit, selling opium to China in exchange for the silver to buy tea. The scheme worked, horribly, catastrophically, but it worked. British and Indian ships began delivering opium to the Chinese coast in the late 18th century, at first in modest quantities, then in rapidly growing ones. Chinese merchants purchased the opium and distributed it inland. Addiction spread. By the 1820s and 1830s, the silver flow had reversed. It was now draining out of China and into British and company coffers. Millions of Chinese were addicted to opium. The social and economic consequences were devastating. The Chinese government was fully aware of what was happening and had banned the opium trade repeatedly. But the trade was enormously profitable for everyone involved in the supply chain, including corrupt Chinese officials who took their cut. And enforcement was difficult along thousands of miles of coastline. In 1839, a determined imperial commissioner named Lin Zexu was sent to Canton, the only port then open to foreign trade, with orders to end the opium trade once and for all. Lin Zexu wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to her moral conscience. He pointed out that Britain forbade the domestic sale of opium within its own borders while profiting from its sale in China. He asked her plainly how this could be considered just. There is no evidence that Victoria ever read the letter. Lin Zexu confiscated and destroyed over 20,000 chests of opium, roughly a year's supply, belonging to foreign merchants at Canton. It was an extraordinary act of principle. Britain responded by going to war. The First Opium War, fought between 1839 and 1842, was a grotesquely unequal contest. British naval technology and firepower were decisively superior. Chinese forces fought bravely in places, but were overwhelmed systematically. The war ended with the Treaty of Nanking, the first of what Chinese historians call the unequal treaties, which ceded Hong Kong to Britain, opened 5 Chinese ports to British trade, and imposed an enormous indemnity. The opium trade was not explicitly legalized in the treaty, but it continued and expanded. A second Opium War followed in the 1850s, and more concessions were extracted. The moral stain on British history is significant and largely uncontested by serious historians. A nation that would come to pride itself on its moral leadership in the abolition of slavery had simultaneously prosecuted a war to protect its right to sell addictive drugs to millions of people. The connection to tea, the beloved, wholesome, quintessentially decent cup of tea, is one that the Victorian era preferred not to examine too closely, but it was real. British tea was, in a direct commercial and political sense, funded by Chinese addiction. It's a history worth knowing, not to make every cup of tea a source of guilt. That would be both excessive and ahistorical. But because understanding what was done in the service of keeping that trade flowing is part of understanding how the modern world was built. The comfortable and the uncomfortable are often made of the same thread. The opium trade did eventually decline, replaced as the balancing mechanism of the tea trade by a different solution entirely. One that involved stolen seeds, a Scottish botanist in disguise, and the mountains of northeast India, which is where we're going next. In 1848, a Scottish botanist named Robert Fortune boarded a ship for China. He spoke no Mandarin. He had no official diplomatic status. He was traveling under a false name, a Chinese name, wearing Chinese clothes, with his hair shaved at the front and a long braid attached to the back of his hat. His mission, quietly authorized by the British East India Company, was to infiltrate the tea-growing regions of China, observe everything he could about how tea was cultivated and processed, and bring back plants, seeds, and knowledge that Britain could use to establish its own tea industry on foreign soil. It was, by any reasonable definition, industrial espionage, and it worked. The idea of growing tea somewhere outside China had been circulating in British colonial circles for decades. The problem was botanical ignorance. The British knew they wanted tea. They didn't know very much about how to grow it, or even, for a surprisingly long time, what plant they were actually looking for. In the 1820s and 1830s, the East India Company had made tentative attempts to cultivate tea in India, particularly in the Assam region of the northeast, where a local variety of tea plant had been discovered growing wild. But the results were underwhelming, and there was a persistent belief in colonial circles that the finest tea, the kind that British consumers actually wanted, could only come from China. Enter Robert Fortune. He had already made one successful journey to China in the 1840s, collecting ornamental plants for the Royal Horticultural Society, and he had a sharp eye and a good deal of nerve. His second mission, the espionage one, took him deep into the Huizhou and Wuyi regions, some of China's most famous and closely guarded tea territories. He posed as a merchant from a distant province, a region far enough away that his accent and mannerisms might plausibly be explained. He hired local guides. He visited tea farms and processing houses. He asked careful questions and watched everything. What he brought back was extraordinary. He collected tens of thousands of tea plants and seeds, packed using a newly invented technology. The Wardian case, a sealed glass container that kept plants alive through the long sea voyage, and shipped them to the company's plantations in Darjeeling and other parts of the Indian hill country. He also brought something arguably more valuable: people. He recruited several skilled Chinese tea workers who understood the processing techniques that transformed fresh leaves into the finished product. These workers sailed to India and spent years training local laborers, passing on the knowledge that Britain had been unable to acquire through legitimate means. The transplantation was not instantly successful. Tea growing is enormously sensitive to soil, altitude, rainfall, and temperature, and it took years of experimentation to understand what the Indian climate required. But the groundwork Fortune laid in the 1850s bore fruit, quite literally, in the decades that followed. By the 1880s, the tea gardens of Assam and Darjeeling were producing on a scale that was beginning to challenge Chinese dominance of the British market. By the end of the century, Indian tea had largely overtaken Chinese tea in British imports. The industry that Britain had built on stolen seeds and smuggled expertise had become the foundation of its colonial economy in the subcontinent. Darjeeling is worth pausing on for a moment, because what grew up in those particular Himalayan foothills is one of the most distinctive teas in the world. Situated at elevations between 600 and 2,000 meters, cooled by cloud and mist, its gardens produce a tea with a floral, muscatel character that has no real equivalent anywhere else. Darjeeling teas are still among the most prized in the world, sold at auction for prices that would astonish anyone who associates tea with the cheap and the everyday. A first flush Darjeeling, the earliest picking of the spring, harvested in March and April, is treated by serious tea drinkers the way a wine enthusiast treats a premier cru, which is to say, with reverence bordering on the religious. Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, became the other great pillar of the British colonial tea industry, and its story involves one of the stranger moments of agricultural history. In the 1860s, Ceylon was primarily a coffee colony. The hills were covered with coffee plantations, the economy was built around them, and the future seemed stable. Then, between 1869 and the 1880s, a fungal disease called coffee leaf rust swept through the island's plantations and destroyed them almost entirely. The colonial planters, facing ruin, turned desperately to alternative crops. A Scottish planter named James Taylor, who had been quietly experimenting with tea on a small patch of land since 1867, suddenly found himself at the center of an industry pivot. By the 1890s, Ceylon had been largely replanted with tea, and it was producing millions of pounds of it annually. And so, from the ruins of one colonial agricultural enterprise, another was built. The tea you find in most British supermarkets today, the robust, dark, uncomplicated tea that goes perfectly with milk and holds up to a long steep, is almost entirely the descendant of what Robert Fortune stole and what the colonial planters grew in the Indian and Ceylon hill country. The taste of the everyday British cup has Chinese origins, but Indian and Sri Lankan roots. A leaf that began in Yunnan was cultivated for centuries in Fujian and Hunan, found its way into the highest rituals of Japanese civilization and the philosophical treatises of Tang Dynasty scholars, was ultimately transplanted by a man in a false braid to the other side of the world, where it was grown by entirely different hands in entirely different soil, and sent back in ships to the country that had wanted it so badly it had fought a war. There is something almost vertiginous about following that thread all the way through. The cup that sits at the heart of British culture, the thing that feels most domestic, most familiar, most simply and uncomplicatedly English, carries a whole world inside it if you know where to look. For most of tea's history, it was the preserve of people who knew what they were drinking. Tea merchants were specialists. Tea drinkers, the ones who cared anyway, learned to distinguish origins, seasons, and processing styles. Tea was something with a provenance, a character, a story. Then the 19th century industrialized it, and a man named Thomas Lipton put it in a packet with his face on the front. The industrialization of tea was part of a broader transformation of food and drink in the Victorian era. Driven by urbanization, rising wages, the growth of a mass consumer market, and new technologies for production and distribution. Tea had already become a staple of British working-class life by the mid-19th century, but it was still bought loose from grocers who kept it in chests and weighed it out by the ounce. Quality varied wildly. Adulteration was rampant. There was a thriving trade in used tea leaves that had been dried and redyed with various substances, including blacklead and iron sulfate, and resold as fresh. The tea-drinking public had no reliable way to know what they were actually buying. Into this chaos stepped a new generation of tea merchants who understood that consistency, branding, and trust were as valuable as the product itself. John Horniman introduced prepackaged, sealed tea in 1826, the first British merchant to sell tea in a fixed-weight, labeled package, and his innovations slowly began to change the market. If the tea was sealed and branded, it was harder to adulterate. If the same name appeared on the package every time, customers could develop loyalty to a product they trusted. Thomas Lipton took this logic and expanded it to a scale that was previously unimaginable. Lipton was a Scottish grocer's son who had made his fortune in the grocery business through aggressive marketing and ruthless cost efficiency. In 1890, he purchased tea estates in Ceylon and began selling directly from plantation to consumer, cutting out every intermediary in the chain. His tea was cheaper than most competitors, consistently blended to a reliable flavor, and packaged with his personal motto, "Direct from the tea garden to the teapot," printed on every box. He advertised with a ferocity that the tea industry had never seen before, plastering his name on everything, sponsoring events, courting publicity. By the end of the 1890s, Lipton was one of the most recognizable names in Britain, and his tea was being sold across the world. The blended tea that Lipton popularized, a mixture of leaves from different origins, proportioned to produce a consistent flavor regardless of seasonal variation, became the dominant form in which most people consumed tea throughout the 20th century. A skilled tea blender's job is not to showcase a single origin, but to maintain a flavor profile year-round, adjusting the proportions of the blend as harvests vary. The breakfast teas, the afternoon teas, the supermarket-owned brands, these are all blended products, engineered for consistency in the way that mass-produced food generally is. This is neither good nor bad. It's just what happens when a luxury becomes a commodity. The tea bag completed this transformation. The invention of the tea bag is one of those stories where the history is messier than the legend. The most commonly cited origin is Thomas Sullivan, a New York tea merchant who around 1908 began sending tea samples to customers in small silk pouches, meant to be emptied into a pot, as with loose leaf, but often simply dunked whole by customers who found this more convenient. Sullivan's accidental invention caught on, and paper versions were developed and refined over the following decades. In Britain, tea bags remained a minority choice well into the 1950s and 1960s, viewed with some suspicion by serious tea drinkers, and slow to penetrate a market deeply attached to the ritual of the loose leaf pot. But convenience won, as it generally does. By the 1970s and 1980s, tea bags had become the dominant form of tea consumption in Britain. Today, around 96% of all tea drunk in Britain is made with tea bags. A figure that would have seemed extraordinary and perhaps slightly depressing to any tea drinker of a previous century. The CTC method, crush, tear, curl, developed in the 1930s and widely adopted in the post-war period, made the tea bag possible at scale. Traditional tea processing rolls and oxidizes whole or gently broken leaves, preserving their complexity and nuance. CTC runs the leaves through machinery that tears and granulates them into tiny, uniform particles that brew very quickly and very strongly. Ideal for a tea bag, which needs to produce a full-flavored cup in the 2 minutes someone stands at a kettle before their morning commute. The result is efficient and reliable, but lacks the depth and subtlety of whole leaf tea. You are trading character for convenience. Most people, most mornings, are happy to make that trade. What's happened in the decades since, though, is interesting. The specialty tea movement, loose leaf, single origin, thoughtfully sourced, has grown steadily as a counterpoint to the mass market. Tea shops with the aesthetic and seriousness of specialty coffee bars have opened in cities around the world. Tea sommeliers exist. Auction prices for rare teas have climbed to extraordinary heights, and the growing global interest in Japanese matcha, now found in everything from lattes to ice cream to face masks, has brought a whole new audience to tea's older, more philosophically serious traditions. It turns out that efficiency and ritual are not mutually exclusive. You can have the tea bag on a Tuesday morning when you're running late, and you can have the carefully measured single-origin oolong on a Sunday afternoon when you have nowhere to be. Tea, characteristically, accommodates both. There is a famous English expression, a storm in a teacup, used to describe a great fuss over something trivial. The irony is that teacups have actually contained some remarkably consequential storms. We've already visited Boston Harbor, but tea's role as a social and political force didn't end with the American Revolution. Tea has turned up, quietly but persistently, at some of the most significant inflection points of modern history. A reminder that the things we consume every day carry more cultural weight than we typically notice. The temperance movement of the 19th century made tea into an explicitly political beverage. Britain and America both experienced widespread problems with alcohol in the industrial era. Gin was cheap and devastating in British cities. Whiskey was everywhere on the American frontier. And the movements that organized against alcohol needed to offer an alternative. Tea became that alternative. Temperance campaigners promoted tea rooms, tea meetings, and tea as a wholesome, sociable, warming drink that offered everything alcohol offered in terms of comfort and community, without the destruction. The British Working Men's Club movement, founded in 1862, was initially teetotal and organized heavily around tea. Temperance hotels served tea. Mission halls offered free tea to the poor. The image of tea as morally respectable, as the drink of the decent and the sober, was consciously cultivated through the temperance movement, and it stuck. Even today, in British culture, there is a faint association between a strong cup of tea and a kind of fundamental decency. The tea that gets made in a crisis. The tea that is offered to someone who has received bad news. The tea that a police officer makes for a witness before asking any questions. This is not an accident. It is the residue of a deliberate 19th century campaign. Tea houses and tea rooms deserve their own moment here, because they were genuinely radical spaces in ways that are easy to underestimate now. The tea room that opened in Glasgow in 1875, run by a woman named Catherine Cranston, who later commissioned the designer Charles Rennie Mackintosh to create some of the most beautiful interiors in Scottish history, was one of dozens of tea rooms that provided something British cities desperately lacked. A respectable public space where women could sit without a male escort, eat and drink without being seen as disreputable, and conduct the business of ordinary social and professional life. Before tea rooms, the respectable options for a woman alone in a city were essentially non-existent. Coffee houses were male spaces, pubs were male spaces, hotels were uncomfortable and expensive. The tea room changed this. It was feminine in its aesthetic, moderate in its prices, impeccably respectable in its associations, and open to women unaccompanied by men. This sounds modest. It was, in practical terms, a small revolution. Women met there to organize. Suffragists met in tea rooms. Business was conducted there. Friendships were maintained there. The tea room was one of the first genuinely public spaces in British life that women could inhabit on their own terms, and that matters. In the political sphere, tea continued to generate controversy well into the 20th century. During the Second World War, the British government, fully aware of tea's psychological importance to civilian morale, nationalized the tea trade and rationed it carefully, ensuring that however scarce other goods became, the daily cup of tea remained available. Churchill reportedly described tea as more important to the war effort than bullets. Whether he actually said this is debated, but the sentiment was real. Tea was understood not merely as a beverage, but as a morale infrastructure, as something that kept people calm and functional under extreme stress. The rationing lasted until 1952, 7 years after the war ended, and its lifting was a genuine national celebration. The symbolic weight of being able to buy tea freely again without a ration book was considerable. It represented a return to normalcy in a way that few other domestic events could. And then there is India. The story of tea and Indian independence is one of the more quietly complex chapters in the history of the drink. Mahatma Gandhi, who organized the famous Salt March of 1930 as a protest against British colonial control of the salt trade, had complicated feelings about tea. Salt was an ancient staple that everyone needed. Tea, Gandhi argued, was a British-manufactured dependency, something the colonial economy had pushed onto Indian consumers to create demand for the products of British-owned plantations. He called on Indians to give up tea as part of the broader project of economic independence, to reject the products that bound them to the colonial system. The appeal largely failed. Indians had been drinking chai, the spiced, milky, deeply sweet version of tea that had become thoroughly indigenous, for generations by then. It had been transformed so completely by Indian hands, Indian spices, Indian custom, that its colonial origin felt beside the point. Chai was Indian now. You could no more ask Indians to give up chai than you could ask the British to give up their cup. The colonized had taken the colonizer's instrument and made it entirely their own. That particular dynamic, the colonized culture absorbing, transforming, and ultimately owning something that arrived as an instrument of colonial power, is one of tea's recurring themes. It happened in India with chai. It happened in Japan with Chado. It happens every time a culture receives tea and refuses to simply consume it as received, insisting instead on remaking it in their own image. Tea arrives, it is changed. It changes things, it stays. Somewhere in Taipei right now, a queue is forming outside a small shop with a pastel-colored sign and a menu board covered in options. The person at the front is ordering a drink that didn't exist 40 years ago. A cold, sweet, milky tea filled with chewy spheres of tapioca that sit at the bottom of a wide plastic cup, waiting to be slurped up through an oversized straw. They are ordering bubble tea, and the person behind them is ordering the same thing, and so is the person behind them. Because this drink, invented in Taiwan in the 1980s, the subject of tremendous debate about who exactly invented it, has become one of the most successful beverage phenomena of the 21st century. Bubble tea shops now operate in virtually every major city on Earth. The global market is worth billions of dollars and is still growing. It has spawned an entire aesthetic. The pastel cups, the satisfying thwack of the plastic straw punched through the foil seal, the jewel-like appearance of the tapioca pearls floating in translucent tea. That has become a kind of international visual shorthand for a certain kind of youthful, urban, digitally connected culture. It is, in its way, as much a cultural phenomenon as afternoon tea was in Victorian England, just significantly more photogenic on Instagram. Bubble tea is only the most dramatic example of what has happened to global tea culture in the past few decades. Tea, which seemed in the mid-20th century to be settling into a comfortable middle age, popular, reliable, not particularly glamorous, has undergone a quiet renaissance that has touched almost every part of the world. Matcha led a significant part of this revival. Matcha is ground green tea. Whole tea leaves stone ground into a fine powder, and it has been central to the Japanese tea ceremony for centuries. But its arrival in Western coffee shops and food culture in the 2010s transformed it from a specialist Japanese product into a global phenomenon. Matcha lattes appeared on cafe menus. Matcha croissants appeared in bakeries. Matcha appeared in chocolates, ice creams, noodles, face masks, and supplements. The particular combination of vivid green color, slightly grassy flavor, and genuine health credentials. Matcha contains significantly more antioxidants than regular steeped green tea, made it irresistible to a generation of consumers interested in both aesthetics and wellness. Serious tea culture has grown alongside the mass market revival. Specialty tea shops now operate in most major cities, offering single-origin loose-leaf teas with the kind of detail and provenance that specialty coffee has offered for years. A first flush Darjeeling from a specific estate, a hand-rolled oolong from the Wuyi Mountains produced in small batches, a white tea from Fujian made from the youngest, most delicate buds, barely processed. The flavors available to someone willing to explore are vast and genuinely extraordinary. Tea has as much complexity as wine, arguably more variety than coffee and the terroir. The idea that a tea grown in one particular valley at one particular altitude will taste different from a tea grown 5 miles away is real and demonstrable. The health dimension of tea has attracted more scientific attention in recent decades, with results that are broadly encouraging. Green tea, in particular, has been studied extensively for its polyphenol content, specifically a compound called EGCG, epigallocatechin gallate, which has shown antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties in research settings. Studies have suggested associations between regular green tea consumption and reduced risk of certain cancers, cardiovascular disease, and cognitive decline. These are associations, not proven causal relationships, and the research is ongoing and not without its complexities. But the basic picture, that drinking tea, especially green tea, in reasonable quantities is good for you, is consistent with several decades of epidemiological research. Lu Yu, writing in the 8th century that tea was a medicine for both body and spirit, was not entirely wrong. In South Asia, the chai culture that Gandhi couldn't dismantle has continued to evolve and spread. The chaiwala, the chai seller who operates from a small cart or stall, brewing strong masala chai in great battered pots over gas flames and pouring it into small clay cups, remains one of the most iconic figures in Indian public life. But chai has also gone international. The spiced tea latte served at Western coffee chains, often called a chai latte, a phrase that is technically redundant since chai means tea, has become one of the most popular drinks in the global coffeehouse market. The combination of black tea, warming spices, steamed milk, and sweetness turns out to have a broad appeal that crosses cultural contexts with remarkable ease. In Britain, tea drinking has declined slightly from its post-war peak, but remains a defining national habit. The average British person still drinks 3 to 4 cups a day. Tea is still the first thing offered to a visitor. The tea break is still a structuring element of the working day. The kettle is still, for most households, the most frequently used appliance in the kitchen. None of this is changing in any fundamental way. What has changed is that alongside the familiar supermarket tea bag, there is now also a loose leaf oolong in a ceramic pot, a matcha whisked in a bowl, a cold brew made overnight in the fridge. The repertoire has expanded. Tea has become more like itself, more various, more interesting, more conscious of its own depth than it was in the century of the single box on the shelf. And around the world, in ways large and small, the leaf continues to find new homes and new forms. Iranian tea houses with their elaborate tile interiors and sugar-steeped glasses. Moroccan mint tea poured from a height to create its characteristic froth, offered 3 times over the course of a visit. The first cup as bitter as life, the second as strong as love, the third as gentle as death, or so the saying goes. Argentine yerba mate, technically not from the Camellia sinensis plant at all, but drunk with the same communal devotion, passed around a circle in a gourd with a metal straw. South Korean tea masters reviving pre-colonial tea traditions that were nearly lost during the Japanese occupation. Taiwanese natural farming producers making teas of such quality and intention that they are discussed and traded with the seriousness of fine art. Tea keeps moving, tea keeps becoming. Thousands of years after those first leaves drifted into a legendary emperor's pot, the conversation between a leaf and a culture is still ongoing, still producing new things, still finding new ways to be exactly what's needed. Tonight we've followed a single leaf across nearly 5,000 years of human history. From a mythological garden in ancient China, through the Zen temples of Japan and the mountain passes of Tibet, across the sea on Dutch ships, into the parlors of England and the harbor of Boston, through the tea gardens of India and the temperance halls of Victorian cities, and all the way to the bubble tea queue in Taipei and the matcha latte on a cafe counter near you. Tea has been medicine, philosophy, currency, contraband, revolution, comfort, and ceremony. It has been stolen and smuggled, taxed and rationed, traded for silver and for opium and for horses. It has been the drink of emperors and factory workers, of monks seeking enlightenment and soldiers seeking warmth. And through every one of those incarnations, it has remained, at its heart, the same simple thing: hot water, a leaf, and a moment of stillness. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight on this long, slow journey through the history of tea. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may your cup always be warm. May you find stillness in the small rituals that hold your days together, and may the simple act of pausing, just for a moment, just for a cup, always feel like enough.